In 1848, on a riverbank in California, a carpenter named James Marshall spotted something bright in the water, and within a year thousands of strangers had abandoned homes, farms, and ships to come find more of it. Almost none of them got rich. The ones who did were mostly the merchants who sold them shovels, tents, and durable trousers. That pattern, a quiet business standing just off to the side of the obvious one, is older than money itself, and it has never stopped repeating. For as long as people have traded anything, someone has been arranging the trade a little in their own favor. A shelf built at exactly the right height, a price ending in a particular digit, an advertisement that invents a tradition out of nothing, a coin quietly thinned of its silver one reign at a time. None of it usually announces itself. It hides inside habits so ordinary that you stopped noticing them long ago, and you have been walking the aisle it wants you to walk, and pausing at the price it wants you to pause at, more often than you would probably guess. 50 of those quiet designs are ahead. A shopping cart nobody would push, a light bulb built to fail, a coin that lost its silver so slowly no one alive noticed, and a fortune made not from gold but from selling to the people chasing it. None of it is advice. It is simply what people have always done with money, and what money has always done with us in return. In 1947, an advertising copywriter typed 4 words to close a routine memo, not guessing they would end up deciding how millions of couples got engaged for the rest of the century. The words were "A diamond is forever," written for the mining company De Beers by the agency N.W. Iyer, and they arrived at a moment when the diamond engagement ring was still a fairly new custom, not an ancient one. Before the 20th century, an engagement gift was often modest, sometimes no ring at all. De Beers wanted a permanent market for a stone people rarely resold, since a diamond keeps its shine indefinitely and almost never enters the second-hand trade the way jewelry usually does. Their answer was to make the diamond mean something a person would never want to sell: love itself. The campaign placed diamonds in films, ran advice columns suggesting a ring's size reflected a man's devotion, and slowly built a custom that felt, to the people living inside it, as old as marriage. It was not old at all. Diamonds themselves are also far less scarce than the campaign implied. De Beers had spent decades quietly buying up mines and controlling output specifically to keep the supply tight and the price high, a strategy of engineered scarcity rather than natural rarity. Decades later, in the 1980s, the same advertising relationship went further and suggested a ring should cost about 2 months of a person's salary, a specific guideline invented for a magazine advertisement, with no older tradition behind it at all. People still repeat that guideline today, as though it were handed down from a grandparent. The same advertising relationship also worked to make an engagement announcement without a diamond look, faintly incomplete in the society pages of the time. Quieter pressure that likely did more to spread the custom than any single advertisement on its own. In recent years, laboratory-grown diamonds, chemically identical to the mined version, have sold for a fraction of the price, a development the original scarcity story never anticipated. It was handed down from a copywriter. In 1924, in a boardroom in Geneva, the men who ran the world's largest light bulb manufacturers signed an agreement that is not popular to admit out loud. They agreed to make their bulbs worse. The arrangement became known, decades later, as the Phoebus Cartel. Companies that would otherwise have competed, including some of the biggest names in electrical manufacturing, instead divided up markets between themselves and agreed on a shared technical standard. No member's bulb should burn for longer than 1,000 hours. Earlier bulbs had reliably lasted twice that long or more. Factories that made bulbs which lasted too long were fined by the cartel's own testing committee, since a bulb that never burned out was a bulb nobody needed to buy again. The arrangement held for years, propped up by the simple fact that a shorter lifespan meant steadier repeat sales for everyone involved. Historians only reconstructed the full extent of the scheme decades later, from surviving cartel meeting records and testing logs. One piece of evidence survived by accident rather than design: a light bulb installed in a fire station in Livermore, California, in 1901, which has burned nearly continuously ever since, decades before the cartel and long after it dissolved. Engineers who have studied it can only say it appears to have been made without the later industry's restrictions in mind. The cartel's members included some of the biggest electrical firms in Europe and North America, and its reach extended across most of the industrialized world at the time, with regional sales quotas assigned to keep any single manufacturer from undercutting the group. Antitrust investigators in the United States eventually pursued legal action against several member companies in the 1940s. though by then the shorter lifespan standard had already shaped an entire generation of bulb manufacturing. The episode became one of the founding examples used whenever the phrase planned obsolescence comes up, the idea that a product can be deliberately designed to fail on a schedule rather than to last as long as it reasonably could. Ask almost anyone why razors are so cheap while the blades that fit them are not, and you will hear the same tidy story, that Gillette gave the razors away to guarantee sales of the blades. It is a good story. It is also not quite what the historical record shows. King Camp Gillette patented his safety razor in the early 1900s, and for as long as that patent held, company pricing records show the razor sold as a premium item, not a giveaway at all. The now familiar strategy, a cheap handle paired with an expensive proprietary blade, only really took hold once the original patents expired in the 1920s, and competitors flooded in selling their own inexpensive blades. Gillette was forced to compete on the price of the razor itself, while protecting its margin on the blade design that remained, for a while longer, harder to copy. A law professor who later traced the company's old pricing filings found the giveaway legend had mostly formed after the fact, retold because it made a cleaner lesson than the messier sequence of patents, competition, and pricing pressure that actually produced it. The underlying shape of the strategy, though, turned out to be genuinely durable. Sell the base device near cost and hold the margin on the thing a customer must keep buying to use it. Company advertisements from the razor's earliest years show it marketed as a refined luxury good, complete with a silver-plated handle in a fitted case, priced well above a plain straight razor of the period. Only once rival manufacturers began selling their own compatible blades cheaply, after the original patents lapsed in the early 1920s, did Gillette's own pricing on the razor itself begin the long slide toward what shoppers now take for granted. Games consoles sold close to their manufacturing cost, while the games carry the profit, printers priced low while ink cartridges are not, and coffee machines given away cheaply while the pods that fit them are not, all echo the same arrangement. Whichever company is credited with inventing it first. Walk into almost any grocery store for a single carton of milk, and notice how far you actually have to walk to reach it. That distance is not an accident of architecture. Grocery floor plans are designed with a deliberate logic. Staples that nearly every household needs every week, milk, eggs, bread, are placed at the far wall or the back corner, so the shortest path to them still crosses the widest possible stretch of the store. A shopper who came in for one item ends up walking past dozens of displays, end caps, and seasonal promotions they never planned to see. Retail planners have a name for the staple items placed this way: loss leaders, priced close to cost, specifically to draw people through the door and deep into the store, where the margin on everything else quietly covers the difference. Produce is often placed near the entrance for a related but slightly different reason, since fresh fruit and vegetables signal quality and freshness them for the rest of the visit, setting a tone for the rest of the visit before a single other item has been chosen. Eggs and butter typically sit near that same back corner as the milk for the identical reason, and the aisles a shopper crosses on the way there are frequently stocked with the store's higher margin goods rather than more staples, since the entire point of the walk is exposure rather than efficiency. Retail researchers who have studied shopper paths describe the effect as modest on any single visit, the kind of small nudge that only becomes significant once multiplied across millions of trips a year. None of this requires manipulation in any dramatic sense. It is closer to a very old, very well-tested piece of choreography, refined store by store over generations, until the walk to the milk cooler stopped feeling like a walk at all, and started feeling like simply where the milk happens to be. When Sylvan Goldman rolled his new folding cart into his own Oklahoma grocery store in 1937, he expected shoppers to be thrilled. Instead, almost nobody would touch it. Goldman had built the cart, essentially a folding metal frame holding two wire baskets on wheels, because he noticed customers stopped shopping the moment their handheld basket got too heavy to carry comfortably. A cart solved that problem completely. Customers, however, had their own reasons to resist it. Men reportedly felt that pushing a cart in public looked frail, something an able-bodied man should not need. Women, by several later accounts, felt a cart implied they were not capable of carrying their own groceries unaided, the way any respectable shopper was expected to. Sales of the new cart stalled almost completely. Goldman's solution was to manufacture the appearance of a norm rather than argue anyone into one. He hired men and women to walk around his store pushing carts and pretending to shop, so that real customers would see other people already using them and quietly follow along. The tactic worked. Within a few years, the cart had become standard across American grocery stores, and eventually across the world, expanding how much a single shopper could physically carry through a store in one trip, and with it, how much a single visit tended to cost. Goldman refined the design through several failed prototypes before settling on the folding frame that finally worked reliably, and once shoppers began embracing it, he patented the invention and founded a separate company manufacturing carts for other grocers across the country. That company eventually made Goldman a far larger fortune than his original grocery stores ever had, built on solving a problem shoppers had not realized until they saw other people already doing it that they wanted solved. The device did not fail because it was a bad idea. It failed briefly because nobody wanted to be first. The checkout line is, by one common measure, the most valuable strip of floor space in an entire store, and the reason has very little to do with rent. It has to do with idle time. A shopper standing in line has already finished deciding what they came for. They are bored, mildly impatient, and holding a small amount of unclaimed attention with nowhere else to spend it. Retailers fill that narrow strip of counter with small, cheap, high-margin items precisely because the mental cost of deciding to buy a candy bar is lower than the discomfort of simply standing there doing nothing. Manufacturers pay for that position the same way they pay for prime shelf space anywhere else in the store, competing for the handful of inches nearest the register the way they might compete for eye-level shelving in the cereal aisle. The practice is old enough that early department stores were already experimenting with small novelty items near the till more than a century ago, long before modern checkout design turned it into a precise science of what sells fastest in under a minute of waiting. Gum, mints, and tabloid magazines have anchored this real estate for the better part of a century, chosen specifically because each is light, compact, and requires no real deliberation before a shopper reaches for it. The rise of self-checkout lanes in recent decades has quietly shrunk how much physical counter space is available for this kind of display, and retailers have responded by testing digital screens and prompts near the payment terminal instead, chasing the same idle attention through a different medium. Nothing about the arrangement requires a shopper to be careless. It simply exploits a very ordinary moment, an unfilled minute, more efficiently than almost any other few feet of retail space in the building. A hospitality research team at Cornell University once tested something quite small: whether the dollar sign printed in front of a price changes how much a diner is willing to spend. It appeared to. Diners who saw a price written as a plain number, with no dollar sign and no word dollars attached, spent more on average across their meal than diners looking at an identical menu where the price carried its usual symbol. The likely explanation researchers offered was not that anyone was fooled about the actual cost. It was that the dollar sign functions as a small, automatic reminder of the act of paying, and removing that reminder softens the moment just enough to loosen a diner's spending a little. Fine dining menus quietly absorbed the finding well beyond the study itself. Many now list prices as bare numerals, avoid printing them in a straight vertical column that makes comparison shopping between dishes effortless, and lean on descriptive language, a dish's origin, its texture, the specific farm it came from, to hold a diner's attention on the food rather than the arithmetic beside it. The original study compared several menu formats side by side, including one that spelled prices out as words rather than numerals at all, and found the plain numeral version consistently outperformed formats that made the cost more explicit to a reader's eye. The finding fed into a wider discipline restaurants now call menu engineering, which also covers where a dish sits on the page, how evocatively it is described in the surrounding text, and how a menu's most profitable items are frequently boxed, highlighted, or placed exactly where a diner's eye lands first when the menu opens. None of these choices change what a meal actually costs. They only change how loudly that cost announces itself on the page, one quiet design decision at a time. Walk onto an older casino floor and try to find a clock. Give it a minute. Notice that you cannot. Casino design, particularly on floors built in the decades before large resort windows became fashionable, has followed a well-documented set of principles built almost entirely around removing any cue that would remind a visitor how much time has passed. No windows meant no daylight to mark the hours. No clocks meant no easy glance to check them. Patterned, often busy carpets discouraged people from looking down and disengaging from the machines around them, and floor plans were laid out with a deliberate maze-like quality, so that walking toward what looked like an exit often led past another row of tables or slot machines instead. Consultants who study casino layout have written openly about these techniques for decades, treating them as an accepted part of the trade rather than a secret. Some of this has softened in recent years, as newer resorts add windows, atriums, and visible clocks, partly for design fashion, and partly in response to changing regulation and public expectation. Free drinks brought directly to a player's table, and staff trained to keep the games feeling social and unhurried, work alongside the missing clocks toward the same end, keeping a visitor comfortable enough to stay seated rather than glance at a watch and decide to leave. Much of this thinking was catalogued and popularized within the industry by design consultants writing specifically about casino floor layout. In the late 20th century, work that many properties still reference today, even as some of the older, more extreme choices have softened. The older instinct behind the design has not really gone away, though. It has simply learned to be a little less obvious about it than a windowless room with no clock in sight. A building manager once resolved a steady flow of complaints about a slow elevator without touching the elevator itself. The story, retold for decades in books on waiting and perceived time, goes like this. Tenants kept complaining that the elevator in their building took too long to arrive, even after engineers confirmed about the mechanism was actually broken. Rather than replace or speed up the elevator, the building installed mirrors on the wall beside the doors, in the waiting area itself. Complaints reportedly dropped, not because the wait got any shorter, but because waiting tenants suddenly had something to do. Check their reflection, straighten a collar, glance at themselves rather than stare at a blank wall or a closed door. Historians of the anecdote are honest that the exact building and date behind the story have grown fuzzy with retelling, closer to an illustrative case than a precisely documented event. The principle it demonstrates, though, shows up again and again in genuinely well-studied research on cues. Occupied time reliably feels shorter than empty time, even when the clock says otherwise. The same idea now sits behind hold music that tells you your position in line, progress bars on a screen that update before anything has actually finished loading, and the small television screens installed above pharmacy counters. It also shows up in a switchback line at a bank or an airport security checkpoint, where a queue folded back on itself inside a roped-off maze feels psychologically shorter to walk than the identical distance covered in one long straight line. Restaurants hand out a buzzing pager for much the same reason, letting a waiting party wander the lobby rather than stand still watching a host stand. The wait itself rarely changes. What changes is whether a person is given something to do while they have it. A price tag reading $3.99 and one reading $4 flat differ by a single cent, and retailers have known for more than a century that shoppers do not treat those two numbers as anywhere near equal. The effect has a name, charm pricing, and decades of retail testing back it up. The likely mechanism is something researchers call left-digit anchoring. A mind scanning a price tends to register the leftmost digit first and weight it most heavily, so $3.99 reads at a glance as being in the threes, while $4 flat reads as being in the fours, even though the true gap between them is a single coin. Retailers have tested this repeatedly across decades of pricing experiments, and prices ending in a 9 have reliably outsold their rounded equivalents by more than the actual saving would predict on its own. The convention now stretches across almost every corner of retail, corner store snacks, supermarket shelves, and car dealerships that list a vehicle at a price ending in $95 rather than the flat number just above it. Online retailers inherited the same convention from paper price tags without ever needing to be told why it worked. One historical theory for how the habit began even traces back to a 19th century retailer who priced goods just under a whole dollar specifically to force his own cashiers to open the till and make change for every sale, creating a paper record that made it harder for an employee to pocket a payment without ringing it up at all, a motive not unlike the one that inspired the cash register itself a few decades later. 1 cent, again and again, across a century of testing, has been worth considerably more than 1 cent. Pick up a bar of Toblerone made after 2016 and look closely at the gaps between its triangular peaks. They are wider than they used to be. That year, the manufacturer widened the spaces between the chocolate's signature triangles and lowered the bar's total weight, while keeping the box itself the same size and the price on the shelf unchanged. The company had been facing rising cocoa costs alongside currency pressure following the vote for Britain to leave the European Union, and rather than raise the sticker price a shopper would notice immediately, it quietly reduced how much chocolate the box actually contained. Almost nothing on the packaging announced the change. It took attentive customers, and eventually the press, to notice the wider gaps and do the math themselves, and the backlash that followed was significant enough that some of the change was later partly reversed. The pattern itself long predates Toblerone. Chocolate bars have shrunk quietly during past economic shocks too, including cost pressures during the Second World War and again during the oil crisis of the 1970s, because the underlying psychology rarely changes. A shopper notices a price increase on a shelf almost instantly, since it sits right there in plain digits, but very rarely notices that a familiar product has gotten a little smaller or a little lighter than it was the last time they bought it. Cadbury made a comparable quiet change to its creme egg boxes around the same period, cutting the count from 6 eggs to 5, while the box kept its familiar size and price, prompting much the same delayed public notice once shoppers eventually did the arithmetic for themselves. Industry monitors who track this kind of change have given it its own popular name, shrinkflation, and note it tends to cluster during precisely the periods when raw ingredient costs are rising fastest across the board. Manufacturers facing rising costs have again and again found it easier to shrink the product than to raise the number beside it. Crouch down to a child's eye level in the cereal aisle sometime and notice which boxes are looking back at you. That shelf position was very likely paid for. Grocery retailers routinely charge manufacturers what the industry calls a slotting fee, a payment for premium shelf placement that has very little to do with which cereal actually tastes best or sells fastest on its own merits. The most valuable real estate on any shelf is eye level for whichever shopper does the actual choosing in that particular aisle, and in the cereal aisle, that shopper is frequently a child riding in the cart, not the adult pushing it. Boxes carrying bright mascots and cartoon characters cluster at a noticeably shorter height than the adult eye-level shelf just above them, stocked with plainer packaging and often a lower price per box. Regulators have periodically studied slotting fees as a practice worth scrutinizing, since what looks to a shopper like the neutral outcome of free competition on the shelf is in part simply a paid arrangement between a manufacturer and a retailer. A similar logic places store brand alternatives just beside or just below a well-known name brand at the adult's own eye level, positioned to catch a price comparing glance at exactly the right moment. A well-known 2003 study by American antitrust regulators found slotting arrangements of this kind touched a significant share of goods on a typical supermarket shelf, prompting debate over whether the practice deserved tighter disclosure rules, so a shopper could tell a paid position from a genuinely earned one. Rival cereal manufacturers have long competed almost as hard for shelf position as they compete for a customer's actual taste preference, since a box nobody can easily see rarely gets picked up at all, regardless of what sits inside it. What looks like a child's favorite cereal is often, first, a landlord's favorite tenant. Some furniture and mattress stores have been having a closing down sale, in one form or another, for years and are still, somehow, open. The trick sitting behind that contradiction is a pricing habit retailers call the perpetual sale. A store sets an official list price that is rarely, if ever, actually charged to any customer, then advertises a permanent discount from that inflated number, so nearly every visitor walks away feeling they caught a genuine bargain that was, in practice, simply the store's ordinary going rate. Furniture and mattress retailing leans on this tactic especially heavily, since these are large, infrequent purchases, and most shoppers have no independent memory of what a fair price actually looks like to compare it against, unlike a loaf of bread or a carton of eggs bought every week. Consumer regulators in a number of places have occasionally challenged this kind of pricing as misleading, arguing that a reference price which was never genuinely charged cannot honestly anchor a claimed discount, and have brought enforcement action against individual furniture retailers over exactly this practice. Mattress retailing draws similar scrutiny for a related reason, because mattress models are frequently built with slightly different specifications for different retailers. Direct price comparison between stores becomes difficult even for a shopper trying earnestly to do their own homework beforehand. The practice has earned enough public skepticism over the years that comedians and consumer advocates alike Joke about furniture stores having been going out of business for as long as anyone can remember, a joke that endures precisely because the underlying pricing pattern is genuinely real. The distinction that actually matters is simple, even if it rarely shows up on the sign. A real limited-time discount depends entirely on the price it is discounted from having been a real price to begin with. What happens to the money loaded onto a gift card that nobody ever spends? A meaningful share of the total value companies issue on gift cards every year is never redeemed at all. Cards get lost, forgotten in a drawer, or partly used and then abandoned once the remaining balance feels too small to bother with. Once redemption becomes statistically unlikely, accounting rules in many places allow a company to recognize that unspent balance as revenue outright, a practice with its own established name inside the industry, breakage. That single term covers a genuinely large amount of quiet, guaranteed profit built into an entire category of retail. It also explains why gift cards are attractive to a business well beyond the value of the initial sale. A redeemed card still functions as guaranteed future foot traffic, often for more than the card's face value once a customer tops up the difference in the store. An unredeemed card is closer to pure, unearned profit. Industry researchers who track the category have estimated unredeemed gift card value adds up to several $1 billion a year in the United States alone, spread across department stores, restaurants, and retailers of every size. Money that technically still belongs to a customer yet functions, in practice, almost exactly like free revenue for whoever issued the card. A related pattern, known informally in the industry as slippage, describes a customer who redeems a card for less than its full balance and never returns to spend the small remainder, leaving a forgotten sum on the books indefinitely. Public attention to just how much unclaimed value has quietly accumulated across the industry eventually prompted some jurisdictions to pass laws requiring cards to remain valid indefinitely, or banning inactivity fees that had been eating away at forgotten balances year after year. Many gas stations make more profit from the coffee and snacks at the counter than from every gallon of fuel pumped outside. Fuel margins are famously thin, heavily taxed, and posted in giant, easily comparable digits visible from the road, which keeps competition on price brutally tight between one station and the next. The convenience store attached to the pumps operates under an entirely different set of rules. Coffee, soda, cigarettes, and lottery tickets all carry markup far beyond what the same items cost the store, sold to a driver who is already standing there for the 2 or 3 minutes it takes to fill a tank, and has little reason left to compare prices with the station down the road. In a real sense, the pumps outside function as a kind of loss leader for the store behind them, drawing in a captive customer whose attention the fuel alone could never fully monetize. Lottery tickets add a further layer to the arrangement in many states, since the retailer earns a commission on every ticket sold regardless of whether anyone wins, turning the counter into a second, entirely separate revenue stream from the one running through the pumps outside. Industry trade groups that track convenience store finances have said for years that fuel sales function closer to a service that draws people in than a genuine profit center in their own right. Car washes attached to many stations serve a similar function, a high-margin add-on sold to a driver already standing at the pump with a few idle minutes to fill. Fuel price wars fought between neighboring stations, sometimes over a difference of a single cent per gallon, only reinforce how little room for profit the pumps themselves actually leave. The gags got a driver through the door. Whatever they picked up on the way to the register is usually what actually paid for the stop. A candy bar sitting inside a hotel minibar is, most of the time, the exact same candy bar sold for a fraction of the price at the shop across the street. The hotel is counting, quite deliberately, on a guest not walking there. Minibar pricing is less a study in the value of chocolate or a small bottle of liquor than a study in captive convenience. A guest pays for the absence of friction at precisely the moment they are least willing to put their shoes back on and leave the room. Hotels have long known that minibar usage rates run fairly low, since most guests do a rough calculation in their head and decide against it, but the margin earned from the guests who do reach for the honesty bar is high enough to make stocking one worthwhile regardless. Some hotel chains experimented as early as the 1970s with early sensor-based minibars, cabinets designed to automatically detect and bill for any item lifted from its slot, cutting down on the staff time otherwise needed to restock and reconcile an honesty-based version by hand. Room service pricing tends to follow an almost identical logic, charging a premium for food a guest could walk downstairs and buy far more cheaply, simply because ordering it requires nothing more than a phone call from a comfortable bed. Hotels rarely advertise minibar or room service pricing, anywhere a guest might see it before booking a room, relying instead on the moment of actual hunger or thirst to make the price feel secondary to the convenience. In recent years, some hotels have quietly scaled back or removed minibars altogether, partly because guests increasingly arrive with their own drinks or order through a delivery app from a nearby store, undercutting the one advantage, sheer captivity, that used to make the minibar profitable almost automatically. Orange juice was barely part of the American breakfast until a 1916 advertising campaign told people to drink an orange instead of eating one. California citrus growers, organized into a cooperative that would later become known as Sunkist, were sitting on a glut of oranges too blemished or misshapen to sell whole in stores. The advertising man Albert Lasker was brought in to solve the surplus, and his answer was to reframe the fruit entirely. Squeeze it, drink it, and treat the result as a modern, healthful, convenient way to start the day. The campaign paired its slogan with home juices marketed directly alongside the message, turning an agricultural oversupply into a genuinely new habit within a single generation. Within a few decades, a glass of orange juice at breakfast had gone from unusual to something close to a national default. Taught to children as simply what breakfast included, rather than remembered as the deliberate invention it actually was. The habit deepened further during the Second World War. Once the invention of frozen concentrated orange juice let the drink be shipped, stored, and reconstituted far more cheaply than fresh juice ever could be, cementing its place in the American kitchen for decades afterward. Florida's citrus industry, competing directly with the original California campaign, built much of its own post-war marketing around the convenience of that frozen concentrate rather than around the fresh fruit itself. Sunkist's own advertising later expanded well beyond juice, applying similar techniques to persuade Americans that a wide range of citrus products belonged in a healthy diet, a template other agricultural cooperatives borrowed for decades afterward. The original glut of unsellable oranges that started it all is easy to forget entirely once a product becomes this deeply woven into a culture's sense of what breakfast is supposed to include. Nobody had been missing orange juice before 1916. They simply had not yet been told to want it. Nearly every Hass avocado sold anywhere in the world today can be traced back to a single tree planted in a Southern California backyard in the 1920s. A postal worker named Rudolph Hass had bought seedlings from a local nursery expecting one variety, and one of the trees that grew, apparently by accident, produced a fruit with thicker, more durable skin than its rivals. That thicker skin turned out to matter enormously, since it let the fruit survive shipping and grocery handling far better than the smoother, more delicate avocados that had come before it. Hass patented the variety in 1935, and essentially the entire modern Hass avocado crop grown worldwide descends genetically from cuttings of that one original backyard tree. The fruit is rise from a fairly obscure item on American shelves to a mainstream breakfast and snack staple took decades longer still, helped along by sustained marketing campaigns from grower associations convincing shoppers the avocado belonged in a salad, on a sandwich, and eventually spread thick across a piece of toast. Marketing built around the fruit accelerated sharply from the 1990s onward, including televised advertising timed to major sporting broadcasts that reframed the avocado as a lively, modern food rather than the obscure specialty item it had been for much of the 20th century, culminating decades later in its association with a single widely recognized breakfast dish. The same period saw avocado prices grow considerably more volatile than many other produce items, tied closely to weather and trade conditions in the handful of regions, chiefly Mexico and California, that supply most of the global crop. None of that volatility has slowed the fruit's cultural rise, and grocery chains now treat a reliable avocado supply as important enough to plan entire produce marketing calendars around it. Shapes an enormous share that no longer stands quietly shapes, an enormous share of what ends up on a plate today. In 1926, a mail-order book club pioneered a billing method so effective that nearly every streaming service and software subscription still runs on some version of it today. The Book of the Month Club shipped a chosen title to its members automatically every period, and charged them for it, unless a member actively mailed back a card in advance declining that particular selection. The default action sat with the company, not the customer. A member had to notice, remember, and act in order to say no. Saying yes required doing nothing at all. That single design choice, small as it looks on paper, had an outsized effect on how many shipments and how many charges simply went through uncontested. The approach earned its own name in marketing circles: negative option billing. Record clubs and encyclopedia sellers adopted close variations of it later in the century, and the direct descendant of that 1926 mailing list model is easy to spot in any modern free trial that quietly converts into a recurring paid subscription unless a customer remembers to cancel inside a specific window. Regulators eventually took notice of just how often the arrangement worked against a customer's own attention rather than their actual preference, and consumer protection rules introduced in various countries in recent years have specifically required that cancelling a recurring subscription be made no more difficult than signing up for one was in the first place, a rule that exists largely because so many companies had for decades quietly made it considerably harder. Even after these reforms, plenty of subscriptions still rely on a customer simply forgetting a renewal date, proof that the underlying incentive to make yes easier than no never really disappeared, only softened at the edges. Getting the book only ever got easier. Saying no to it never quite did. A well-known behavioral economics experiment once offered magazine readers 3 subscription choices, and the middle option was never really meant to be chosen at all. The researcher Dan Ariely tested this directly with real subscription offers from The Economist: a web-only plan for $59, a print-only plan for $125, and a combined print and web plan for that same $125. On its own, almost nobody wanted the print-only option, since paying full price for less than the bundle offered made no sense. Its presence changed everything else, though. Compared against a plainly worse choice at an identical price, the combined plan suddenly looked like the obvious win, and a large share of readers chose it. When the middle option was removed entirely, leaving only the web-only and combined plans side by side, far more readers picked the cheaper web-only option instead. The extra choice had never really been meant to be bought. It existed purely to change what the other 2 options looked like standing next to it, an effect researchers now call the decoy effect. Cinema concession stands are frequently cited as a real-world version of the same test, since a small popcorn priced only slightly below a medium, and a medium priced only slightly below a large, tends to push undecided moviegoers toward the largest size available, not because they wanted that much popcorn, but because the size just beneath it suddenly looked like a poor use of the difference in price. The same quiet nudge shows up today in streaming subscription tiers and phone data plans, wherever an option that nobody is really meant to choose sits deliberately between 2 that are. Menu designers have borrowed a close variant of the same trick for combo meals, pricing food and drink separately just high enough that the bundled deal starts to look, by comparison, like the only sensible order to make. Offer someone a choice between a cheaper item and a free one worth roughly the same amount less, and people will overwhelmingly take the free one, even when the plain arithmetic says it should not matter at all. In one classic behavioral pricing experiment, shoppers were offered a choice between 2 chocolates, a plain one priced at 1 cent and a nicer one priced at 15 cents. Most people, reasonably, chose the nicer chocolate for the extra 14 cents of quality. Researchers then dropped both prices by exactly 1 cent, so the plain chocolate became free and the nicer one cost 14 cents, leaving the actual gap between the 2 totally unchanged. Preferences flipped almost entirely. The overwhelming majority of shoppers switched straight to the free chocolate, even though their bargain, 14 cents either way, was mathematically identical to what it had been a moment earlier. Researchers came to call the pattern the zero price effect. The word free appears to trigger a different, less calculating kind of decision than any other discount, however small. The same instinct explains why a buy one get one free promotion consistently outperforms an equivalent straight percentage taken off both items, even when a careful shopper working out the totals would find the discount comes to exactly the same amount either way. A related field experiment found the same pattern held for shipping costs online. Dropping a small shipping fee to 0 increased how many items people added to their cart, far more than an equivalent price cut on the item itself ever managed to. Retailers have taken the lesson to heart directly, favoring buy one, get one free signage over a plainly equivalent percentage off sign at the register. Even though a shopper doing the arithmetic finds the 2 offers identical, something about the number 0 seems to switch off the comparison shopping instinct almost entirely. It is often said that Roman soldiers were paid partly in salt, and that the word salary comes directly from that practice, and the story is a good deal tidier than what historians of Latin have actually been able to confirm. The connection between salt and salary is real at the level of the word itself. Salarium, the Latin term generally accepted as the root of salary, is genuinely built from sal, the word for salt. Where historians grow far more careful is the specific mechanism behind that word. No surviving Roman source actually documents a legionary receiving salt itself as a wage. The more likely explanation, favored by most specialists who have examined the evidence, is that salarium referred to a soldier's allowance, possibly earmarked for purchasing salt, or simply a general stipend that invoked salt symbolically because of how valuable and essential it was, rather than payment made in literal salt handed over at the paymaster's table. The vivid, direct version, soldiers marching off with their wages measured out in salt, gets repeated constantly in trivia lists and etymology books precisely because it is such a satisfying concrete image. Rome did maintain a genuinely important salt trade, evidenced by the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, an ancient route still named for the commodity that once moved along it from coastal salt works into the interior of the peninsula. That real infrastructure is likely part of why the soldiers paid in salt version feels so plausible in the first place. Salt was clearly valuable enough in Roman life to shape place names and trade routes, even if the specific payment story built on top of that value turns out to be considerably less certain. Roman writers themselves rarely discussed a legionaris salarium in enough operational detail to settle the debate one way or the other, which is exactly why the question remains genuinely open rather than resolved. The etymology it is built on is considerably shakier than the story deserves. In parts of Ethiopia, hardened bars of salt, known as amole, circulated for generations as genuine, widely accepted currency, remaining in active use well into the 20th century. Unlike the far more contested story of Roman soldiers and their supposed wages, salt currency across parts of the Horn of Africa and West Africa is thoroughly documented in the historical and anthropological record. Traders carried standardized salt bars, cut and shaped consistently enough to function as a reliable, trusted unit of value, exchanging them for gold, livestock, grain, and cloth across regions where salt itself was genuinely scarce and universally necessary for preserving food and feeding animals. The bars worked as money for reasons that have nothing to do with tradition or symbolism, and everything to do with plain, practical qualities. They were durable enough to survive long caravan routes, easy to divide into smaller units for smaller transactions, and unwanted by essentially everyone who crossed paths with a trader carrying them, regardless of which kingdom or trading post that trader happened to be passing through that week. 19th century European travelers who documented Ethiopian markets described the amole bars circulating alongside the Maria Teresa thala, a silver coin minted continuously for trade across large stretches of Africa and the Middle East, with salt typically covering smaller daily transactions and the coin reserved for larger ones, a working practical division of labor between two very different physical forms of the exact same underlying idea. Those are the same basic qualities that make any object suitable to function as currency, whether it happens to be a stamped metal coin, a printed banknote, or in this case, a solid bar of salt carried across a desert on the back of a camel. It's worth understood at a glance by absolutely everyone it passed between. The earliest objects historians widely recognize as true coins were struck in the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, sometime around the 7th century before the Common Era. The coins were made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, stamped with an official mark from the Lydian mint at the city of Sardis, guaranteeing a fixed weight and purity to anyone who accepted the coin in trade. Archaeologists later recovered a large hoard of these early Lydian coins at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, physical evidence that let modern researchers study and date the innovation directly rather than relying on later written accounts alone. Before this innovation, trade across the ancient world ran largely on weighed bullion and direct barter, and every transaction required someone, often both parties, to independently verify the metal's purity and weight from scratch, a slow, cumbersome, and easily disputed process that could stall a transaction for as long as both sides needed to reach agreement. A stamped coin solved that friction in one stroke, letting a trusted central authority vouch for the metal once, at the mint, rather than requiring every merchant further down the chain of trade to reweigh and retest it for themselves. The idea spread outward from Lydia across the ancient Mediterranean within a handful of generations, picked up and adapted with local variations by Greek city-states and the trading powers that followed them. Lydia's most famous king, Croesus, is still remembered today in the English phrase rich as Croesus, and his mint later moved beyond electrum entirely, striking coins of nearly pure gold and nearly pure silver separately once refiners learned to reliably separate the two metals, a refinement that made a coin's value even easier to trust at a glance. The stamp, not the metal, was the actual invention. When the West African ruler Mansa Musa passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca in the 1320s, he gave away so much gold that the price of gold in Egypt stayed depressed for years afterward. Musa ruled the Mali Empire at the height of its wealth, built on control of some of the richest gold and salt trade routes in the medieval world. His pilgrimage caravan was, by contemporary accounts on both sides of the journey, staggering in scale. Thousands of attendants, enslaved servants, soldiers, and camels, carrying an enormous quantity of gold that Musa distributed freely as gifts and alms along the route, and especially once he reached Cairo. The city was already a major hub of regional trade, yet the sudden flood of gold entering its markets was large enough relative to the existing local supply that its value measurably dropped, and by some accounts took over a decade to fully recover. Chroniclers in Cairo recorded the visit with genuine astonishment at the time, which is precisely why the story survives independently in sources outside West Africa itself, not only as an oral legend passed down within Mali. Musa's generosity in Cairo was only part of a broader legacy. He returned from the same pilgrimage with scholars and architects who helped transform Timbuktu into one of the era's great centers of learning, home to the Moms manuscript libraries that still define the city's reputation today. Some modern historians have gone so far as to describe him as possibly the wealthiest individual in recorded history, though his exact fortune can never be precisely measured against rulers from such different economies and eras. It remains one of history's clearest illustrations of a basic principle of money: value tracks relative supply, and a single act of spending on a large enough scale can visibly move a market that seemed, until that moment, far too large for any one person to shift. China's Song dynasty issued the world's first government-backed paper money, called jiaozi, centuries before Europe trusted a printed note over an actual coin. Jiaozi began, informally, as private deposit receipts issued by merchants, certificates representing a quantity of coin held safely elsewhere, useful to traders who did not want to haul heavy strings of metal coins across long and often dangerous trade routes. The system originated specifically in Sichuan province, where the local currency relied on unusually heavy iron coinage, making a paper substitute especially attractive for merchants who otherwise had to transport cartloads of iron just to complete an ordinary transaction. Recognizing how useful the system had become, the state eventually took over issuing the notes directly and standardized their design and backing. The trouble arrived later, under financial pressure, when subsequent authorities discovered that printing more notes was far easier than mining more metal to back them. Song's authorities also learned, through hard experience, to limit how many notes any single issue could put into circulation and to set expiration dates requiring old notes to be exchanged for new ones. Early and only partly successful attempts to keep the system from outrunning its own credibility. Successive rounds of oversupply gradually eroded public confidence in what a jiaozi note could actually be exchanged for, and the currency lost real value even as its printed face amount stayed exactly the same. Centuries later, the Mongol rulers of the Yuan dynasty expanded paper currency further still, and the Venetian traveller Marco Polo described the system to a European audience that found the entire idea, a government note worth real goods without being made of precious metal at all, almost impossible to believe. It stands as one of the earliest well-documented cases of inflation, caused specifically by an issuer expanding a paper currency faster than the underlying economy could support it. The Roman denarius fell from nearly pure silver to only a few percent silver across roughly 2 centuries, so gradually that for long stretches almost nobody alive noticed it happening. Facing mounting military costs and treasuries that rarely held enough to cover them, successive emperors repeatedly reduced how much precious metal actually sat inside the coin, while keeping its face value, size, and general appearance essentially unchanged. Historians now call this process debasement, and its genius, if it deserves the word, was its patience. The dilution moved slowly enough, reign by reign and generation by generation, that any single person's own lifetime rarely offered enough contrast to notice the coin in their pocket had changed at all. Eventually, the cumulative effect became impossible to hide. As prices for ordinary goods climbed sharply, Once merchants and soldiers realized just how little actual silver the coin in their hand still contained compared to the one their grandparents had carried. The Emperor Nero is often credited with an early, deliberate round of this debasement in the 1st century, and the practice accelerated dramatically during the political chaos of the 3rd century, when a rapid succession of short-lived emperors needed cash to pay restless armies faster than any legitimate tax system could raise it. By that point, the coin had become little more than cheap metal dipped in a thin wash of silver, a far cry from the solid piece its own design still claimed to be. Archaeological analysis of surviving coins, measuring silver content directly rather than relying on written record alone, is what let modern research reconstruct the debasement's exact timeline so many centuries later. Debasement functioned as a quiet, old form of taxation, letting a government spend money it did not actually have by diluting the value of the money it had already put into circulation, a strategy governments have returned to, in one form or another, many times since. At the peak of Dutch tulip mania in the winter of 1637, certain especially prized bulbs reportedly traded for more than the price of a fine house on an Amsterdam canal. The most famous example, a rare stripe variety known as Semper Augustus, owed its flame-like petal pattern to a virus infecting the bulb, and genuinely commanded extraordinary sums among wealthy collectors and specialist growers alike at the very height of the market that winter. The full popular legend, though, tends to run further than the documented record supports. The historian Anne Goldgar, working from surviving contracts and notarial records, found that most bulbs traded during the period sold for far more modest amounts, and that serious speculation involved a relatively narrow circle of wealthy merchants and specialists rather than the broad cross-section of Dutch society the retelling often implies. Much of the trading happened not with bulbs in hand, but with paper contracts promising a bulb still buried in the ground for winter, an arrangement that functioned much like a modern futures contract centuries before anyone used that term. When prices finally collapsed in February 1637, Dutch courts largely declined to enforce these contracts as ordinary debts, treating the collapse more as a gambling dispute than a straightforward broken promise, which likely spared many speculators from the ruin the legend insists befell them. The widespread ruin supposedly left behind, families and fortunes wiped out overnight once the market collapsed, also appears considerably exaggerated across centuries of retelling, without the scale of bankruptcy record one would expect from a truly catastrophic bust touching ordinary households. Tulip mania was genuinely real and genuinely strange. It was also smaller and far more contained than a great many retellings, including some later economics textbooks, have made it out to be over the centuries since. In 1720, a speculative frenzy over a trading company's stock swept through London so completely that even Isaac Newton was pulled into it and came out having lost a substantial sum. The South Sea Company had been granted a monopoly on trade with South America in exchange for absorbing a portion of the British government's debt, and its stock price climbed to extraordinary heights on expectation and public enthusiasm rather than on any real trading profit the company had yet earned. Rumour, insider dealing, and a wave of copycat, speculative ventures competing for the same excited investors all fed the rise. Comparable manias struck other European markets that very same year, evidence the frenzy was less a uniquely British failing than a wider financial fashion of the moment. When confidence finally broke, the price collapsed within months, ruining investors across British society, including members of the aristocracy and, by most accounts, Newton himself, who had reportedly sold early at a tidy profit only to buy back in near the very top of the market. A line often attributed to him afterward, about being able to calculate the motion of the heavens but not the madness of people, is repeated constantly, though historians are honest that its precise wording, and even its true origin, remain genuinely uncertain, closer to a well-circulated legend than a documented quotation. A parliamentary inquiry followed the crash, one of the earliest formal government investigations into a financial bubble, and led directly to legislation restricting the formation of new joint stock companies without a royal charter, a law that shaped British corporate structure for more than a century afterward. The word bubble itself, already used informally before the crash, became permanently attached to this particular episode, entering the financial vocabulary as the standard term for any market rise built more on expectation than on underlying value, a usage that has never really left the language since. Medieval church law forbade charging interest on a loan outright, so the merchant bankers of Florence found a way to collect something very much like it anyway, hidden inside a piece of paper. The instrument was the bill of exchange. A merchant in Florence could lend money in one currency, payable at a future date in a different city and a different currency entirely, and the exchange rate built quietly into that arrangement carried a profit margin that functioned economically like interest, without technically being labelled as such under canon law. The Medici Bank used this instrument extensively, letting it finance trade, wars, and building projects across Renaissance Europe while remaining, at least on paper, within the letter of a prohibition that had never anticipated commerce operating at this scale or across this many borders. The practice helped fund the Medici family's rise from wool merchants to the effective rulers of Florence and patrons of much of the Italian Renaissance that followed. The bank operated branches across major European cities, including Rome, Venice, London, and Bruges, tracked through increasingly sophisticated bookkeeping that let the Florence head office monitor accounts thousands of miles away. Double-entry bookkeeping, refined and popularized partly through Italian merchant banking of this same period, gave the Medici and their rivals a clearer, more current picture of exactly how exposed any single branch had become at any given moment. The institution's fortune did not last forever. Poor loans to unreliable royal clients, including the English crown under Edward IV, helped drag the Medici Bank into decline by the end of the 15th century. A reminder that even the family that helped define modern banking was not immune to a bad loan. Bills of exchange, in shapes not far removed from the Medici original, became one of the foundational instruments of modern international banking long after the underlying usury prohibition had quietly faded from enforcement. The German banker Jakob Fugger financed the bribes that won Charles V his election as Holy Roman Emperor, and the newly crowned emperor spent years afterwards still owing him the money. Fugger, remembered even in his own lifetime by the nickname Fugger the Rich, built his fortune in the city of Augsburg through mining interests and lending, eventually stretching a banking network across Europe that touched Rome, the Habsburg court, and the flow of silver arriving from the Americas. When the imperial election of 1519 came down to a contest, decided largely by which candidate could pay the electors the most, Fugger's financing tipped the outcome in the Habsburgs' favour, and Charles took the crown carrying a debt to a single merchant house that would take years to fully settle. Contemporary chroniclers described the family's combined fortune as larger than most European royal treasuries of the era, a claim modern historians studying surviving Fugger account books have found broadly credible. The episode shows just how deeply private banking fortunes had become intertwined with the political fate of entire empires by this period, when the outcome of an imperial election could hinge on one family's ledger. Fugger's bank also financed the sale of indulgences within the Catholic Church around the same period, a practice that helped provoke the protests that grew into the Reformation, tying the family's business dealings directly into one of the largest religious upheavals in European history. Beyond banking, Fugger also built the Fuggerei in Augsburg, a walled settlement of modest housing built specifically for the city's poorest workers. Offered at a token rent that has remained essentially unchanged for 5 centuries, still inhabited today, it is widely considered the oldest social housing complex in the world. An unusual legacy for a man remembered mainly for financing an emperor's election. For much of medieval Europe, charging interest on a loan was formally classed as usury, a sin considered serious enough to bar a person from a proper Christian burial. Canon law's blanket prohibition did not eliminate lending so much as push it into a series of workarounds. Fees were charged for a lender's service rather than for the loan itself. Currency exchange margins, of the kind used by Florentine bankers on their bills of exchange, quietly carried a profit that behaved like interest without being named as such. Entire legal doctrines eventually developed carving out exceptions for the genuine risk a lender took on by parting with money at all. The theologian Thomas Aquinas gave the prohibition its most influential philosophical grounding, arguing that money itself was naturally barren and could not justly generate more money simply by being lent, unlike land or livestock, which visibly produced a return of their own. Franciscan friars later established Montes Pietatis, pawnshops that lent small sums to the poor at low church-sanctioned rates, an officially blessed alternative meant to undercut lenders charging harsher terms outside the sanctioned system entirely. The prohibition also shaped, over centuries, who was formally permitted to lend openly in different parts of Europe. Some communities were barred from many other trades and forms of land ownership, and were pushed toward moneylending as one of the few professions still open to them, then stigmatized for the very occupation they had been funneled into. An unfair and costly arrangement that shaped centuries of European social history. The theological line against usury eroded only gradually across several centuries, as trade outgrew what purely local, face-to-face lending could realistically support, and merchant bankers found paper instruments and quiet cooperation from church authorities who needed financing themselves more useful than strict enforcement of the old rule. England once routinely imprisoned ordinary people for the simple fact of owing a debt they could not repay, and the practice continued well into the 19th century. Institutions like London's Marshalsea held debtors, sometimes with their families living alongside them inside the prison walls, until whatever was owed had somehow been settled, an arrangement that in practice usually made repayment harder rather than easier, since an imprisoned debtor had little means left to actually earn the money required to pay a creditor back. Debtors inside these institutions were often required to pay for their own food and lodging while imprisoned, a bureaucratic cruelty that could deepen the very debt supposedly being punished. Wealthier prisoners could sometimes purchase additional privileges, including permission to live within a defined area just outside the prison walls known as the liberties, while poorer debtors received no such relief and simply waited, often for years, for a family member or benefactor to settle what was owed. Similar institutions operated across much of Europe during the same period, and reform campaigners in several countries pointed specifically to England's example, both its cruelty and its eventual abolition, when arguing for changes to their own domestic debt laws over the decades that followed. The novelist Charles Dickens knew the institution firsthand. His own father was imprisoned for debt at the Marshalsea, and Dickens himself, still a child, was sent to work in a shoe polish factory while his family lived inside the prison, an experience that shaped much of his later writing about poverty and institutional cruelty. Parliamentary reform gradually narrowed the practice through the middle of the 19th century, and imprisonment for simple debt was finally abolished in Britain in 1869, following mounting public unease with an institution that punished poverty, as though poverty itself were the crime. Before the middle of the 19th century, the price of nearly anything sold in a shop was a matter of negotiation until one retailer decided every customer should simply pay the same marked price. John Wanamaker's Philadelphia department store, opened in the 1870s, became one of the most prominent examples of this shift, replacing haggling entirely with a fixed price tag stated plainly on every item, paired with a money-back guarantee that let a dissatisfied customer return a purchase without an argument. The combination changed the basic relationship between a shopper and a shopkeeper. A customer no longer needed bargaining skill, social standing, or personal familiarity with the merchant to be confident they were paying a fair price, and could walk away from a purchase and reconsider it later without any pressure to commit on the spot. Wanamaker also pioneered other retail firsts still recognizable today, including full-page newspaper advertising built around the store's fixed prices rather than any private negotiation. He is often credited with a line that remains a favorite among advertisers to this day, admitting that half of what he spent on advertising was wasted, the trouble being that he could never work out which half. Wanamaker's store was also among the first in America to install electric lighting throughout its selling floors and to include a restaurant inside the building itself, turning an ordinary shopping trip into something closer to a full day out rather than a quick, purely functional errand. The approach spread quickly once customers experienced how much friction it removed from ordinary shopping, and fixed retail pricing gradually became the near-universal default everywhere except a handful of markets, used cars and real estate chief among them, where negotiation still quietly lingers today, holdouts against an otherwise near-total shift in how an entire economy agrees on what something costs. 19th century Paris shopkeepers discovered something simple yet powerful. A plate glass window filled with goods could pull a stranger in off the street without a single word ever being exchanged between them. The Bon Marché, widely credited as one of the first true department stores, combined large glass display windows with fixed, deliberately low margins spread across a very high volume of sales, and an open browsing policy that let a visitor wander the floor and examine anything on display with no obligation to buy a thing. Its founder, Aristide Boucicaut, understood that turning a purchase from a plain transaction into something closer to an afternoon's entertainment would keep customers returning even on days they had nothing specific in mind to buy. The store's methods fascinated contemporaries enough that the novelist Émile Zola modeled an entire book on it, Au bonheur des dames, portraying the department store as a kind of glittering machine built to seduce its customers, one gorgeously arranged window at a time. Boucicaut also introduced clearly marked sale events and consistent return policies, additional techniques that reinforced the same underlying promise. A shopper could trust the store enough to look without obligation and buy without regret. Boucicaut's wife Marguerite, who took over leadership of the store after his death, went for the still, introducing paid vacation and a pension plan for employees decades before such benefits became common practice elsewhere in retail. The model, refined over the following decades, spread outward from Paris to department stores across Europe and North America, and the glass display window itself, a genuine novelty when the Bon Marché first tried it, became such an ordinary fixture of retail everywhere that it is easy to forget it was ever a deliberate invention at all, rather than simply how a shop window has always looked. Long before airline miles or a coffee shop's loyalty app, generations of ordinary shoppers pasted small paper stamps into collectors' books, patiently saving toward furniture, kitchenware, and toys they might otherwise never have afforded outright. Trading stamp programs, of which S&H green stamps became the best-known American example, handed a shopper a set number of stamps proportional to how much they spent at a participating store. The stamps were carefully licked, pasted into a collector's book by hand one row at a time, and eventually redeemed for merchandise chosen from a dedicated catalogue. At the program's peak in the 1960s, S&H reportedly printed more stamps each year than the United States Postal Service printed postage, a scale that gives some sense of just how deeply the habit had embedded itself into ordinary household shopping. The company eventually opened dedicated redemption centers stocked like small department stores, entirely devoted to letting customers exchange a book of pasted stamps for the merchandise they had been saving toward all along. Rival programs, including Top Value stamps and Pled stamps, competed for the same grocery store shelf space and the same loyal customers, turning the humble paper stamp into a genuine point of brand competition between otherwise unrelated retailers. The programs turned ordinary, repeat grocery shopping into a slow, genuinely satisfying accumulation, giving a shopper a concrete reason to keep returning to the same handful of stores rather than simply shopping wherever happened to be cheapest that particular week. The stamp books themselves eventually declined as they grew cumbersome against newer technology and changing retail habits, but the underlying logic behind them, reward a customer's loyalty with points redeemable later for something genuinely wanted, survived essentially intact and now runs quietly behind nearly every modern punch card, membership tier, and mobile rewards app. The mechanical cash register was invented by a saloon owner who suspected his own bartenders were stealing from him and built a machine specifically to catch them at it. James Ritty ran a saloon in Dayton, Ohio, and grew convinced that money was disappearing from his, till without his knowledge, though he could never quite prove how. According to the popular account, he was inspired by a mechanical counter he saw aboard a steamship, a device that recorded the number of revolutions the ship's engine made, and he adapted the same basic principle to record sales instead of engine turns. Ritty's machine logged every transaction on a paper tape and rang a bell loudly enough for a customer to hear the sale being recorded in real time, making it far harder for an employee to complete a sale and quietly pocket the cash without anyone noticing. He patented the device in 1879 and called it, without a great deal of modesty, the incorruptible cashier. Running a manufacturing business alongside his saloon quickly wore Ritty down, and within a few years he sold the patent rights to a group of investors led by John Patterson, who built the fledgling business into the National Cash Register Company, a firm that would go on to dominate the industry for generations under an even simpler name, NCR. Ritty's own saloon, ironically, closed not long after he sold the patent, though the machine he built to protect it went on to shape how nearly every retail transaction in the world would eventually be recorded and verified. Other inventors and manufacturers later refined and mass-produced the design far beyond Ritty's original saloon, but the underlying idea, an auditable, tamper-resistant record of every single sale as it happens, remains the entire foundation of modern retail bookkeeping, present in one digital form or another behind almost every checkout counter on Earth. A single bottle of Coca-Cola cost a nickel from the 1880s all the way until the early 1950s, a price the company held remarkably steady through a world war and decades of rising costs pressing against it the whole time. The fixed 5-cent price was locked in partly by long-term bottling and distribution contracts signed early in the company's own history, and partly, more curiously and more memorably, by nothing grander than simple vending machine mechanics. For decades, the coin-operated machines that sold Coca-Cola across the country were built to accept only a single coin, and redesigning every one of those machines nationwide to take a second coin, or a different denomination altogether, was expensive, and logistically difficult enough that the company found it easier to hold the price exactly where it had always been. Company President Robert Woodruff reportedly went so far as to raise the possibility, with United States Treasury officials, of minting a new coin worth 7.5 cents, a denomination that would have let Coca-Cola raise its price cleanly without redesigning a single vending machine across the country. The idea never went anywhere, and the nickel price held for years afterward regardless, a small reminder of just how far a company will go to avoid the cost of changing infrastructure rather than the cost of the product itself. Rival soft drink makers who tried to compete on price during these same decades often found it just as difficult to move independently of Coca-Cola's fixed point, since vending machines, once installed and paid for, were expensive for any bottler to redesign around a different price. The nickel price finally gave way only once rising costs made holding the line no longer sustainable, ending one of the longest stable consumer prices in American retail history. Adam Smith famously noticed a puzzle in the 18th century. Water is essential to staying alive and costs almost nothing at all, while a diamond serves no real survival purpose whatsoever and still costs a small fortune. Smith raised the puzzle in his writing on economics without fully resolving it himself, and it sat there genuinely unresolved, for roughly a century afterward, discussed by economists as a real contradiction in how value seemed to work. The puzzle was finally resolved during what historians of economics now call the marginal revolution of the 1870s, when several economists working independently, including William Stanley Jevons in England, Karl Menger in Austria, and Leon Walras in Switzerland, arrived at essentially the same insight around the same time without any of them having read the other's work first. Later economists worked out the answer by looking at the value of one additional unit of a good rather than the value of the entire category. Water is abundant enough, in most places, that one more glass of it adds very little extra value to a person who already has plenty of it close at hand. Diamonds remain scarce enough that one more of them still carries substantial value to whoever acquires it. The resolution, now taught as one of the founding insights of modern economic theory, explained how an essential good can be nearly free while a purely decorative one commands enormous sums, simply by attending to what the next unit is worth rather than what the whole category is worth. The insight quietly undercut centuries of assuming that value must track how genuinely useful a thing is, replacing that older intuition with a sharper, more mathematical way of asking what any single additional unit of a good is actually worth to the person deciding whether to buy it. During the California gold rush, a dry goods merchant named Levi Strauss made a lasting fortune, not by finding gold, but by selling durable trousers to the men who were looking for it. The gold rush drew hundreds of thousands of prospectors to California within a few short years, and the overwhelming majority of them lost money chasing gold directly, worn down by the cost of travel and equipment and simple bad luck against a resource that only a small fraction of them ever found in any meaningful quantity. The merchants supplying that crowd with picks, shovels, tents, and sturdy work clothing built far steadier businesses instead, selling to a guaranteed and fairly desperate customer base, regardless of how much gold any individual prospector actually managed to find. The rivet idea itself is usually credited first to Jacob Davis, a Nevada tailor who had been using copper rivets to reinforce work pants for his own customers but lacked the money to file a patent on his own. Davis wrote to Strauss, his fabric supplier in San Francisco, proposing they patent the idea together and split the cost, and the two men filed jointly in 1873, a partnership that produced the modern blue jean and a fortune neither could likely have built alone. The story has since become a lasting shorthand lesson, repeated well beyond mining history, about who tends to profit most reliably from any sudden rush, whether the resource is gold, oil, or anything else, rarely the person chasing it, and far more often the one selling the equipment everyone chasing it needs. the company Strauss and Davis built has outlasted the gold rush itself by more than a century and a half, still selling a version of the same reinforced trousers long after the last prospector packed up and went home. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia record interest, bearing loans of grain and silver from roughly 4,000 years ago, complete with agreed repayment terms pressed into the clay itself. Temple and palace institutions in ancient Sumer functioned as some of the earliest known banks, lending grain to farmers between one harvest and the next, and expecting repayment with an agreed additional amount once the new harvest came in. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest surviving law codes, went further still and set legal ceilings on how much interest could be charged, differently for loans of grain versus loans of silver. One of the first known attempts by any government to regulate lending directly rather than leave the terms entirely to private arrangement between two parties. The ceilings set were specific. Interest on loans of silver was capped at around 20%, and interest on loans of grain at around 33%. Rates high by modern standards but explicitly limited rather than left to whatever a lender could extract from a desperate borrower. Trained scribes drafted and witnessed these agreements, a professional class whose entire livelihood depended on a system of lending precise and trusted enough to commit to permanent record. What stands out most, reading the tablets that survive, is how thoroughly modern the basic shape of these ancient contracts still looks. A stated principal amount, an agreed rate, a named borrower and lender, and a specific date by which repayment was due. The same essential elements that appear on a loan document written out today, 4,000 years, and a great many civilizations later. Some tablets even record disputes over these loans being brought before local officials for judgment, evidence that the system carried real legal weight rather than functioning as a purely informal understanding between neighbors. Cowrie shells, gathered from a handful of tropical coastlines, circulated as currency across parts of Africa and Asia for longer than most metal coinages have existed. The shells were valued for being small, naturally durable, remarkably uniform in size and shape, and effectively impossible to counterfeit with the tools available at the time, making them a genuinely reliable unit of trade across huge stretches of West Africa, parts of India, and China at various points in history. Continents away, wampum, cylindrical beads cut and polished from certain shells, served a closely related purpose among various indigenous nations of northeastern North America, functioning as both a form of currency and a way of recording agreements and treaties, a use European colonists later adopted for their own trade purposes as well. Most of the cowrie shells that ended up circulating in West Africa originated thousands of miles away, gathered chiefly in the Maldive Islands of the Indian Ocean, and carried along Arab and later European trade routes until they reached markets that had never seen the ocean they came from. Wampum belts served an even more formal function in parts of North America, recording specific treaties in the pattern of their beads, including the two-row wampum agreement between Dutch colonists and the Haudenosaunee, an arrangement its keepers still reference today as a living historical record rather than a museum piece. The two systems developed entirely independently of one another, separated by an ocean and by centuries, yet converged on remarkably similar solutions to the same basic problem: a small, durable, naturally scarce object that nobody could simply manufacture more of at will. That is the same underlying requirement any workable form of money has always had to satisfy, whether it ends up being a shell, a metal coin, or a stamped piece of paper. Gas station prices in the United States have ended in 0.9 cents for roughly a century, a fraction too small to actually hand over at the pump. Historians offer more than one explanation for where the practice began, and the exact founding reason is genuinely disputed among them. One common account traces it to early state fuel taxes assessed in fractions of a cent per gallon, which stations folded directly into the posted price, down to the 0.1 cent, in order to stay precisely compliant with the tax owed. A separate explanation points instead to plain charm pricing psychology, the same left-digit anchoring effect that keeps supermarket prices ending in 99 cents, applied here to a much smaller unit because gasoline sells in such large, price-sensitive volume that even a fraction of a cent adds up noticeably across a full tank. Whichever explanation actually started the habit, the convention has persisted for roughly 100 years regardless, long outliving the specific tax rules and pricing fashions that may have originally caused it, mostly because every station in a given market has a strong self-reinforcing reason to keep matching whatever every other station nearby is already doing. Modern digital price signs make changing a number as easy as pressing a button, removing whatever printing and labor cost might once have discouraged updating a fractional price daily. A handful of states have gone so far as to write the 9/10 convention directly into fuel pricing regulation, turning what began as an informal habit into an actual legal requirement in some places, regardless of whichever original cause historians eventually settle on, a rare case of an accidental habit hardening all the way into statute, long after almost anyone could say for certain where it had actually started. Some large grocery and warehouse chains have sold a fully cooked rotisserie chicken at a price that reportedly does not cover what the chicken costs the store to prepare, and have held that price steady for years at a time. The arrangement is a famous, deliberate example of a loss leader. A single, visibly cheap, instantly recognizable staple pulls a shopper through the door and, more importantly, down every other aisle on the way to collect it. A company willing to accept a small loss on the chicken itself can more than recover the difference on everything else a shopper picks up along the way, from produce to household goods, to items carrying far higher margins built quietly into their own price. Some of these retailers have gone as far as building dedicated poultry farms and processing plants specifically to control the supply chain behind this one item, treating the low price less as a marketing gimmick than as a long-term operational commitment worth serious capital to sustain. Unsold birds nearing the end of the day are frequently repurposed into other prepared foods sold elsewhere in the store, chicken salad, soup, and sandwiches among them, squeezing additional value out of a product already sold at a deliberate loss in its original form. Holding that price flat for years, even as ingredient and labor costs rise elsewhere across the store, also functions as a highly visible, easily remembered signal of value, one that keeps customers returning and comparing the rest of the store favorably against it, an outsized marketing effect produced by a single, deliberately underpriced item. The strategy has held remarkably steady across economic downturns, ingredient shortages, and rising labor costs alike, treated internally less as a promotion to revisit each quarter than as a fixed pillar of the store's whole identity. Tipping arrived in America as a European aristocratic custom, copied by wealthy travelers returning home from abroad, and then took root far more firmly in the United States than it ever did back in Europe. American restaurant and railroad industries adopted the practice widely in the decades after the Civil War, partly as a way to avoid paying a full direct wage to certain service workers, many of them newly freed Black Americans working as railroad porters, and in similar roles at the time. That arrangement was later written directly into federal law when the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a separate, lower minimum wage specifically for tipped employees, a structure that persists in various forms across much of the country today. Tipping was not universally welcomed when it first spread through America. A vocal anti-tipping movement grew in the early 20th century, with several states passing laws banning the practice outright around 1900, arguing it encouraged a kind of civility poorly suited to a supposedly democratic society. Those bans proved difficult to enforce and were mostly repealed within a decade or two, and tipping went on to become far more entrenched in American life than the custom its critics had once hoped to stamp out entirely. Meanwhile, in much of Europe, service charges were increasingly built directly into the listed price of a meal, or added openly to the bill as a fixed percentage, and the custom of tipping further on top of that faded considerably compared to its American counterpart. The result is two service economies that grew out of a genuinely shared origin and settled, over the following century, into very different arrangements between what an employer pays directly and what a customer is expected to quietly add afterward, at the end of the meal. The exact same flowers, the exact same cake, and the exact same venue can carry a noticeably different price tag once a vendor learns the event actually being planned is a wedding. Consumer reporting has repeatedly documented vendors quoting higher prices for what is, functionally, an identical product or service, the moment the word wedding enters the conversation. Vendors who have spoken about the practice openly generally point to two justifications. One is an assumption that a couple planning a wedding is drawing from a larger, less price-sensitive budget than an ordinary customer booking the same service for an ordinary occasion. The other is simpler and more practical. A wedding date typically cannot be moved or postponed the way an ordinary purchase can, which quietly removes some of a customer's usual leverage to simply walk away and shop elsewhere if the price feels wrong. Couples who have compared quotes after describing the same event without ever using the word wedding have sometimes found the gap narrows considerably, though the practice is inconsistent enough across individual vendors and regions that no single reliable figure can describe it across the board. Journalists testing the pattern directly have sometimes requested quotes for the identical date, guest count, and services twice, once describing the event as a wedding and once describing it as an anniversary party or another private celebration, and reported meaningfully different numbers coming back for what was, on paper, an identical booking. Some vendors, stung by this kind of public scrutiny, now advertise a single flat rate regardless of the occasion's name, treating uniform pricing itself as a selling point worth featuring prominently in their own marketing, a quiet, deliberate reversal of the very practice that made the single word wedding worth a premium to so many vendors in the first place. A small paper cup of free food handed out in a grocery aisle changes buying behavior far out of proportion to its size or its cost. Free samples appear to work through more than one mechanism at once. There is plain exposure, letting a shopper try something they might never otherwise have picked up off the shelf on its own. There is also a well-documented psychological pull toward returning even a genuinely tiny favor, once someone has handed you something for nothing, with a purchase of some kind in return. Researchers studying reciprocity as a general principle of persuasion have found it can operate on a scale far smaller than most people would expect. A single free taste is often enough to noticeably shift buying odds for the rest of that particular shopping trip. Retailers weigh the modest cost of running a sample table, staff time and product spent on tasting portions, against the fairly reliable lift in sales that follows, and for a great many stores the arithmetic favors sampling comfortably enough that the practice has persisted across generations and across wildly different kinds of products. Costco is often cited as the most extensive practitioner of this strategy, running sample stations throughout its stores on the busiest shopping days specifically to reach the largest possible number of customers with the smallest possible taste of a product. Timing appears to matter almost as much as the sample itself. A taste offered to a rushed, distracted shopper works far less reliably than one offered to someone already browsing slowly with time to actually consider what they have just been handed. A single memorable taste can also linger well past the shopping trip itself, quietly shaping which brand a customer reaches for automatically the next time they need that same kind of product, long after the sample table itself has been packed away. In August 1971, the United States ended the promise that a dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, closing a chapter of monetary history that had lasted for generations. The Bretton Woods system, established near the end of the Second World War, had pegged the American dollar to gold at a fixed rate and pegged other major currencies to the dollar in turn, giving the post-war international monetary system a single stable anchor to hold on to. Facing mounting strain on its gold reserves as other countries increasingly sought to redeem their dollar holdings for actual gold, the American government suspended that convertibility in a single televised announcement, decision historians often refer to now as the Nixon shock. The announcement came on a Sunday evening in a television address that famously interrupted a broadcast of the Western series Bonanza, catching much of the viewing public by surprise mid-episode. The change moved the world's major currencies onto what is generally called a fiat system, one where a currency's value rests on trust in the issuing government and its central bank, rather than on a fixed weight of metal sitting in a vault somewhere backing every note in circulation. Ordinary transactions were essentially unaffected in the moment, since nobody buying groceries that particular week had been exchanging dollars for gold bars anyway, even as the underlying architecture of the entire international monetary system changed completely within that single announcement. Once gold was allowed to trade freely rather than at a fixed government rate, its price rose substantially over the following decade, a market finally allowed to set a value the old system had held artificially still for so long, decades after most people buying their weekly groceries had stopped thinking about gold, or the dollar's old promise, at all. The world's most famous insurance market began as a 17th-century London coffee house, where shipowners and merchants gathered over coffee to trade news and hedge against the sea. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, opened near the Thames in the 1680s, became a natural gathering place for sailors, ship captains, and merchants eager for the latest shipping news, since Lloyd himself reportedly kept a reliable list of arrivals and departures for his regular customers to consult. Merchants and wealthy individuals who gathered there began pooling risk on individual voyages informally, each underwriter literally writing their own name beneath the specific share of a ship's potential loss they were personally willing to cover, which is where the word underwriter itself comes from. The shipping news Lloyd, once compiled by hand for his customers, eventually grew into Lloyd's List, a dedicated shipping newspaper first published in the early 1700s that continues in some form today, one of the oldest continuously running publications in the world. The market itself outgrew the coffee house within a few generations, moving first to rented rooms at the Royal Exchange and eventually into its own purpose-built headquarters, though it never dropped the original name of the coffee house, where merchants first gathered to write their own signatures beneath a stranger's risk, one voyage at a time. What began as an informal arrangement between the regulars at a single coffee house gradually formalized, over the generations that followed, into a structured insurance market with its own rules, its own dedicated building, and its own considerable reputation, eventually becoming one of the oldest and largest insurance institutions in the world, one that still carries the name of a coffee house owner who never set out to invent an entire industry, and likely never imagined his own name would end up printed on policies covering ships, satellites, and disasters he could not have begun to picture from behind his own counter. For more than 600 years, the English Treasury recorded debts on notched wooden sticks, and when officials finally decided to burn the obsolete sticks in 1834, the fire got out of control and burned down the Houses of Parliament. A tally stick worked by notching a piece of wood to represent an amount owed, then splitting it lengthwise down its grain. One half, called the stock, kept by the Crown or the creditor, the other half, the foil, kept by whoever owed or was owed the debt. Because the two halves had originally been a single piece of wood, the pattern of the grain and the notches had to match perfectly for a debt to be verified and honoured. An elegantly simple, tamper-resistant receipt system that required no literacy, no paper, no ink, and no signature at all, and that worked reliably for centuries as a genuine method of government accounting across much of medieval and early modern England. By the early 1800s, paper record-keeping had long since replaced the practice, and in 1834 officials decided the enormous accumulated stockpile of old, obsolete tally sticks stored beneath the House of Lords was simply clutter to be disposed of. Workers were instructed to burn the sticks in 2 underfloor stoves rather than have them carted away and properly disposed of elsewhere, and the resulting fire, fed by centuries of dry, well-seasoned wood, grew far larger than anyone had planned, spreading beyond the stoves to consume most of the Palace of Westminster in a single night. A records disposal, ordered because the old system had finally come to seem too antiquated to keep, ended up destroying the very seat of government the disposal had been meant to help modernize past it, wood outliving the paper it was replaced by, one final time, in the worst possible way. Somewhere in California, the riverbank where James Marshall once found his glint of gold is a quiet park today, and the crowds that came looking for a fortune are long gone. Most of what they were chasing never found its way into their pockets at all. It went, instead, to the people who sold them what they needed to keep looking, the shovels, the trousers, the tents. That was never really a story about gold. It has never been a story about gold. It is the same story, 50 times over, told in a shopping cart nobody wanted to push. A diamond that only felt scarce because a copywriter said so, a coin that lost its silver one reign at a time, and a bell above a saloon till, built specifically to catch a thief. Nothing in this list was ever a true secret. Retailers openly discuss slotting fees among themselves. Historians openly correct the tulip legend in their own published work. A law professor put the whole razor and blade myth into a paper anyone can go and read. The designs were never hidden so much as they were simply quiet, running underneath habits so ordinary that asking why felt like a strange thing to bother doing in the first place. You will walk a grocery aisle again this week, glance at a price ending in 99 cents, maybe even pass a gift card sitting forgotten in a drawer somewhere in the house. None of that needs to change tonight. There is no instruction here, no clever move to make, nothing to buy or sell or fix about the way you already handle your own money. There is only the quiet fact that someone, somewhere, has usually thought about the arrangement a little harder than you have, long before you ever walked into the room. That was true in Lydia, it was true in Amsterdam, in Cairo, in a fire station in California, where an old bulb is by now still burning. It is still true today, in whichever store you happen to walk into next.